November 11, 1988. Sacramento police stand in a boarding house backyard, staring at what looks like a mass grave disguised as a garden. 7 decomposing bodies lie buried beneath the roses and vegetables, their flesh melting into the California soil while the woman who put them there collected their government checks month after month. Dorothea Puente didn't look like a killer. The 59-year-old grandmother ran a clean boarding house on F Street, cooking meals for elderly and disabled tenants who had nowhere else to go. She wore floral dresses, attended church regularly, and spoke softly about caring for society's forgotten people. Her tenants trusted her with their lives, their money, and their medications. That trust killed them. Puente had been systematically poisoning her most vulnerable tenants with their own prescription drugs, watching them die slow, agonizing deaths before dragging their bodies into her backyard and burying them like garbage. She forged their signatures, cashed their Social Security checks, and told neighbors they'd moved away to live with family. For years, she turned murder into a profitable business model. When police finally caught up with her, Puente had fled to Los Angeles, where detectives found her sitting calmly at a bar, sipping vodka and reading a newspaper while her victims' bodies were being excavated from her property. She showed no emotion, no remorse, no acknowledgement that she'd just been exposed as one of California's most prolific female serial killers. How does a sweet grandmother become a predator who preys on the helpless for profit? Welcome to Savage Case Files. In this video, we expose the Golden State's deadliest female killers, women who turned the California dream into their victims' worst nightmare. Subscribe now if you enjoy the kind of untold true crime stories we bring to you on this channel. Stay tuned. The next case will show you just how far a mother will go to destroy her own child. Case 2. Pearl Fernandez. May 22, 2013. A cramped apartment in Palmdale, California, where 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez lay dying on the floor, his small body destroyed by months of systematic torture that his own mother had allowed and encouraged. Pearl Fernandez, the woman who should have protected him above all else, had instead turned their home into a chamber of horrors, where her boyfriend Isidro Aguirre brutalized her son while she watched. Gabriel wasn't some troubled child who'd pushed his mother to the breaking point. He was a sweet, innocent boy who loved his siblings and tried desperately to please the adults who were supposed to care for him. But Pearl saw him as an obstacle to her relationship with Aguirre, a burden she was willing to sacrifice to keep her violent boyfriend happy. The abuse escalated over months of unimaginable cruelty. Gabriel was beaten with baseball bats, shot with BB guns, forced to eat cat litter and his own vomit, and locked in a cabinet for hours at a time. His teachers noticed the bruises, the black eyes, the obvious signs of abuse, but their reports to Child Protective Services were ignored or mishandled by a system that failed him completely. On that final day, Pearl called 911, claiming Gabriel had fallen and hit his head. Paramedics found the boy unconscious with a cracked skull, broken ribs, burns, and bite marks covering his tiny frame. He died 2 days later, his short life ended by the people who should have loved him most. The investigation revealed a pattern of torture so severe that even hardened detectives wept at the crime scene. Pearl had not only allowed the abuse, but had actively participated in it, helping Aguirre devise new ways to torment her son. In 2018, Pearl Fernandez pleaded guilty to first-degree murder with torture and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gabriel's death sparked massive reforms in California's child welfare system, but no amount of policy changes could bring back the boy whose mother chose a boyfriend over her own child's life. Case 3. Marjorie Knoller. January 26, 2001. The narrow hallway of a San Francisco apartment building where 33-year-old Diane Whipple was returning home from grocery shopping unaware that two massive Presa Canario dogs were about to tear her apart while their owner, attorney Marjorie Knoller, stood by and did nothing to stop the attack. Knoller wasn't some inexperienced dog owner who'd lost control of her pets. She and her husband, Robert Knoll, were attorneys who had adopted the 120-pound dogs from a client serving time in prison for running an illegal dogfighting operation. They knew these animals were bred for violence, trained to kill, and had already shown aggressive behavior toward neighbors in their Pacific Heights building. But Knoller loved the power these dangerous animals gave her, the fear she saw in people's eyes when she walked them through the upscale neighborhood. She ignored complaints from neighbors, dismissed warnings from veterinarians, and refused to muzzle dogs that had already bitten multiple people. On that Friday evening, Knoller was bringing the dogs back from a walk when they spotted Whipple in the hallway. The animals immediately attacked, pinning the lacrosse coach against her apartment door and savaging her with their powerful jaws. Whipple screamed for help as the dogs ripped at her throat, arms, and legs, but Knoller made no real effort to control them. When police arrived, they found Whipple's body covered in over 77 bite wounds, her clothes shredded, and blood splattered across the hallway walls. Knoller claimed she'd tried to stop the attack, but witnesses heard her yelling at Whipple to shut up rather than calling off her dogs. The investigation revealed that Knoller knew her dogs were deadly weapons. She'd received multiple warnings about their aggressive behavior, had been told they needed professional training, and had ignored every opportunity to prevent this tragedy. In 2002, Marjorie Knoller was convicted of second-degree murder, making her one of the first people in California history to be held criminally responsible for a fatal dog attack. She was sentenced to 15 years to life, her legal career destroyed by her refusal to control the killing machines she'd unleashed on her community. From deadly pets to deadly obsessions that destroy entire families. Case 4. Betty Broderick. November 5, 1989. A luxurious Hillcrest mansion bedroom where Dan Broderick and his new wife Linda lay sleeping, unaware that Betty Broderick, Dan's bitter ex-wife, was creeping through their home with a loaded .38 revolver, ready to end the marriage that had destroyed her life and driven her to the edge of madness. Betty hadn't always been a killer. For 16 years, she'd been the perfect corporate wife, supporting Dan through law school and medical school, raising their 4 children, and building the wealthy lifestyle they'd always dreamed of. She'd sacrificed her own career ambitions to make Dan successful, trusting that their marriage was forever. But Dan had other plans. He began an affair with his young legal assistant Linda Colkenna, then systematically destroyed Betty's life through a vicious divorce battle that left her financially ruined and emotionally shattered. He used his legal connections to manipulate custody arrangements, froze her assets, and had her arrested multiple times for violating restraining orders. The final betrayal came when Dan married Linda just months after their divorce was finalized, flaunting his new relationship while Betty struggled to survive on a minimal settlement from the fortune she'd helped him build. On that November morning, Betty used her key to enter Dan's house, found the couple sleeping peacefully in their bed, and opened fire. She shot Dan in the back and Linda in the chest, killing them both instantly before fleeing the scene. When police arrested Betty later that day, she showed no remorse for the murders. She told investigators that Dan had driven her to it, that he'd destroyed her life and left her with nothing, while he lived in luxury with his young wife. The trial became a media sensation, with Betty's supporters arguing she was a victim of an abusive divorce system that favored wealthy men over discarded wives. Prosecutors painted her as a cold-blooded killer who'd murdered 2 innocent people out of jealousy and greed. In 1991, Betty Broderick was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. She remains incarcerated today, her case becoming a symbol of how divorce can turn love into deadly hatred. Case 5. Leslie Van Houten. August 10, 1969. a quiet Los Feliz neighborhood where Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were about to become victims of one of the most notorious murder sprees in American history, killed by a group of young followers who believed Charles Manson was Jesus Christ and that mass murder would trigger a race war called Helter Skelter. Leslie Van Houten wasn't some damaged runaway from a broken home. The 19-year-old had grown up in a middle-class family, been a homecoming princess, and seemed destined for a normal life, until she fell under Manson's hypnotic influence at his Spawn Ranch commune. Within months, the former honor student had transformed into a willing participant in brutal murder. On that August night, Van Houten rode with other family members to the LaBianca house, where they planned to commit copycat murders that would free their imprisoned leader. While Manson and others killed Leno LaBianca in the living room, Van Houten held down Rosemary LaBianca in the bedroom and stabbed her repeatedly in the back and buttocks. The 44-year-old grocery store owner fought desperately for her life, but Van Houten showed no mercy, continuing to plunge the knife into her victim even after Rosemary had stopped moving. She later admitted to stabbing the woman at least 14 times, claiming she wanted to participate fully in what she believed was a holy mission. After the murders, Van Houten helped write Death to Pigs and Rise on the walls in the victim's blood, part of Manson's plan to make the killings look like the work of Black Panthers and ignite his prophesied race war. The investigation that followed exposed the full horror of the Manson family's crimes, with Van Houten showing no remorse during her initial trial. She giggled in court, sang Manson's songs, and proclaimed her loyalty to the man who'd turned her into a killer. Van Houten was initially sentenced to death, but when California temporarily abolished capital punishment, her sentence was commuted to life, with the possibility of parole. She spent the next 5 decades in prison, eventually expressing genuine remorse for her crimes and earning multiple college degrees. In 2023, after 54 years behind bars, Leslie Van Houten was finally granted parole, becoming the first Manson family member to be released from prison. Her freedom sparked outrage from victims' families, who argued that some crimes are too heinous to ever forgive. From cult murders to poison plots that turned marriage into murder. Case 6, Kristen Rossum, November 6, 2000. A Claremont apartment where 26-year-old Greg DeVillers lay dead on his bed, surrounded by red rose petals in what appeared to be a romantic suicide scene straight out of the movie American Beauty. But the toxicologist wife who discovered his body had actually murdered him with a lethal dose of fentanyl, then staged the scene to cover up her crime. Kristen Rossum wasn't some grieving widow devastated by her husband's death. She was a brilliant scientist who worked at the San Diego County Medical Examiner's office, where she had access to deadly drugs and the knowledge to use them as murder weapons. Her marriage to Greg was falling apart because of her affair with her married supervisor and her growing addiction to methamphetamine. Greg had discovered Kristen's drug use and was threatening to expose her addiction, which would have destroyed her career and sent her to prison. Rather than face the consequences of her choices, Kristen decided her husband had to die. On that November evening, she slipped a massive dose of fentanyl into Greg's drink, then watched as the powerful opioid shut down his respiratory system. After he died, she scattered rose petals around his body and called 911, claiming she'd found him dead in what appeared to be a suicide inspired by the Kevin Spacey film. But Kristen had made critical mistakes that would expose her elaborate deception. The autopsy revealed that Greg had died from fentanyl poisoning, but there was no evidence he'd ever used the drug before. Investigators discovered that fentanyl had gone missing from the medical examiner's office around the time of Greg's death, and that Kristen had been the last person to handle it. More damaging evidence emerged when police found that Kristen had been researching fentanyl overdoses on her computer and had purchased the rose petals hours before Greg's death. Her affair with her supervisor provided clear motive, and her access to deadly drugs gave her the perfect murder weapon. At trial, prosecutors painted Kristen as a cold-blooded killer who'd used her scientific expertise to commit the perfect murder, only to be undone by her own arrogance and sloppy planning. In 2003, Kristen Rossum was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her case became known as the American Beauty murder, proving that even the most educated killers can't outsmart forensic science. Case 7. Omaima Nelson. November 28, 1991. A Costa Mesa apartment where 56-year-old William Nelson lay dead on the floor, his body mutilated beyond recognition by his 23-year-old wife, Omaima, who had not only killed him, but had spent hours dismembering his corpse and cooking parts of his flesh in their own kitchen. Omaima Nelson wasn't some obvious psychopath who'd shown warning signs of violence. The former model from Egypt had married the older businessman just months earlier, and neighbors saw them as a typical couple with the usual age gap dynamics. But behind closed doors, their relationship had devolved into a nightmare of abuse, violence, and ultimately cannibalistic murder. On that Thanksgiving night, what started as another domestic argument escalated into deadly violence. Omaima later claimed that William had been abusing her, but the evidence suggested something far more disturbing than self-defense. After killing her husband, Omaima spent the next several hours systematically dismembering his body with kitchen knives and a chainsaw. She cooked his head in a pot on the stove, fried his hands in a skillet, and boiled other body parts in various pans throughout their apartment. Neighbors later reported smelling what they thought was an elaborate Thanksgiving dinner cooking. But Omaima's grotesque feast was just the beginning of her cover-up attempt. She stuffed William's remaining body parts into garbage bags and tried to dispose of them in dumpsters around Orange County. She cleaned the apartment obsessively, trying to remove all traces of blood and evidence of the dismemberment. She even attempted to use his credit cards and forge his signature to make it appear he was still alive. The investigation began when William's business associates reported him missing. Police discovered blood evidence in the apartment that Omaima had failed to clean completely, and her story about William leaving town fell apart under scrutiny. The most shocking evidence came when investigators found human remains in various dumpsters around the area, along with the cooking pots and utensils Omaima had used to prepare her husband's flesh. The medical examiner confirmed that some of the body parts showed evidence of being cooked at high temperatures. At trial, Omaima's defense team argued that she'd been a battered wife who'd snapped after years of abuse. But prosecutors focused on the deliberate dismemberment and cannibalism that went far beyond any reasonable self-defense claim. In 1993, Omaima Nelson was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. Her case remains one of the most disturbing examples of domestic violence turned cannibalistic murder in California history. Case 8. Jennifer Henderson. November 15, 2004. Newport Harbor, where retired couple Tom and Jackie Hawks were about to take what they thought would be a routine sea trial of their yacht, well-deserved, with potential buyers. Instead, they were sailing to their deaths, murdered by a group of killers led by Jennifer Henderson's husband, Skylar DeLeon, who wanted their boat and was willing to kill for it. Jennifer Henderson wasn't some innocent wife dragged into her husband's criminal schemes. The 23-year-old mother knew exactly what Skylar was planning and played a crucial role in luring the Hawks to their deaths. She helped create the fake identity they used to contact the couple, participated in planning meetings, and even brought her baby along to the marina to make them appear like a legitimate young family interested in buying a boat. The Hawks were experienced sailors who had spent years cruising the Pacific, but they trusted the young couple who seemed genuinely interested in purchasing their 55-foot yacht. Tom and Jackie had no idea they were dealing with a group of killers who had already murdered before and were planning to make them disappear forever. On that November afternoon, the Hawks met the De Leons at the marina for what they believed would be a simple test drive. Once they were out at sea, Schuyler and his accomplices overpowered the elderly couple, tied them to the yacht's anchor, and threw them overboard while they were still alive. Tom and Jackie Hawks drowned in the Pacific Ocean while their killers sailed back to shore in their stolen boat. Jennifer's role was to provide the alibi and help dispose of evidence after the murders. She helped forge documents to transfer ownership of the yacht, participated in selling the couple's belongings, and maintained the fiction that the Hawks had simply decided to sell their boat and disappear. But the Hawks family knew something was wrong when the couple failed to contact them as planned. The investigation revealed that the buyers' identities were fake, and that Jennifer and Schuyler had used similar schemes to target other boat owners in the past. The case broke open when investigators discovered that the De Leons had murdered another person just days before killing the Hawks, and that Jennifer had been present for the planning of both crimes. At trial, prosecutors proved that Jennifer Henderson was far from an innocent bystander. She had actively participated in the conspiracy, helped lure the victims to their deaths, and profited from their murders. In 2008, Jennifer Henderson was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her case proved that some killers hide behind the facade of young parenthood while planning the most heinous crimes imaginable. Case 9. Stephanie Lazarus. February 24, 1986. A Van Nuys condominium where 29-year-old Sherry Rasmussen lay dead on her living room floor, beaten and shot 3 times in what appeared to be a botched burglary. For 23 years, the case went unsolved while the real killer continued working as an LAPD detective investigating crimes just like the one she had committed. Stephanie Lazarus wasn't some corrupt cop who'd gradually turned to crime. She was an obsessed ex-girlfriend who couldn't accept that her former lover, John Houten, had married someone else. Lazarus had dated Houten in college and continued pursuing him even after he'd moved on, showing up at his workplace and calling him repeatedly, despite his clear lack of interest. When Houten married Sherry Rasmussen in 1985, Lazarus saw the new wife as an obstacle that needed to be eliminated. On that February morning, Lazarus used her police credentials to gain entry to the Rasmussen condo, confronting Sherry about her marriage to John. What started as a confrontation escalated into a violent struggle that ended with Lazarus shooting Sherry 3 times with her service weapon. To cover up the murder, Lazarus staged the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong, stealing some electronics and ransacking rooms to support the false narrative. Her police training helped her avoid leaving obvious evidence, and her colleagues in the LAPD never suspected that one of their own had committed the crime. For over 2 decades, Lazarus continued her career in law enforcement, rising through the ranks while Sherry's family begged detectives to investigate John's ex-girlfriend. But the LAPD dismissed their concerns, refusing to seriously consider that a police officer could be the killer. The case finally broke in 2009 when cold case detectives decided to test DNA evidence that had been collected from the crime scene. The results matched Stephanie Lazarus, who was still working as an LAPD detective 23 years after committing murder. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Lazarus initially denied any involvement, then claimed she couldn't remember details from so long ago. But the forensic evidence was undeniable, and investigators realized they'd been working alongside a killer for decades. At trial, prosecutors revealed the depth of Lazarus's obsession with Houten and her inability to accept that he'd chosen another woman. They argued that she'd used her position as a police officer to commit the perfect murder, only to be undone by advances in DNA technology. In 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. Her case exposed how law enforcement officers can use their authority and training to commit crimes and evade justice for decades. Case 10. Suzanne Polk. October 13, 2002. An upscale Orinda home where 70-year-old psychologist Felix Polk lay dying on his study floor, stabbed multiple times by his 44-year-old wife Susan in what she claimed was self-defense, but prosecutors argued was cold-blooded murder rooted in decades of twisted psychological manipulation. Susan Polk wasn't some typical battered wife who'd finally fought back against an abuser. Her relationship with Felix had begun when she was just 15 years old, and he was her 39-year-old therapist. A deeply unethical relationship that had evolved from patient-doctor to sexual affair to marriage when she turned 18. For 20 years, their marriage had been a battleground of psychological warfare, custody disputes, and escalating violence. By 2002, their relationship had completely deteriorated. Felix was threatening to have Susan committed to a psychiatric facility and was fighting for custody of their teenage son. Susan believed her husband was trying to destroy her life and take away everything she cared about, including her children and her freedom. On that October evening, Susan confronted Felix in his study about their ongoing custody battle. According to her testimony, he attacked her first, but the physical evidence told a different story. Felix had been stabbed 5 times, including wounds to his back that suggested he'd been trying to flee when Susan continued her attack. The crime scene revealed a prolonged struggle that ended with Felix bleeding to death, while Susan called their son to help clean up the blood. She initially claimed that Felix had been killed by intruders, then changed her story to self-defense when investigators found no evidence of a break-in. The investigation exposed the toxic dynamics of their marriage, including Susan's history of erratic behavior, her obsession with conspiracy theories, and her belief that Felix was part of a plot to have her institutionalized. Friends and family described a woman who had become increasingly paranoid and violent in the months leading up to the murder. At trial, Susan chose to represent herself, turning the courtroom into a circus as she ranted about government conspiracies and portrayed herself as a victim of her husband's psychological abuse. She argued that their relationship had been built on manipulation and control, and that she'd killed Felix to protect herself and her children. Prosecutors painted a different picture, arguing that Susan had murdered her husband in a fit of rage over their custody dispute and financial settlement. They pointed to the multiple stab wounds and the lack of defensive injuries on Susan as evidence that this was murder, not self-defense. In 2006, Susan Polk was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 16 years to life in prison. Her case highlighted the complex dynamics of relationships that begin with power imbalances and evolve into deadly confrontations decades later. Case 11. Veronica Gonzalez. July 7, 2016. A Ventura County home where 3-year-old Adrian Gonzalez endured months of systematic torture at the hands of his own mother, Veronica, and her boyfriend, Ivan Aguirre. Suffering abuse so severe that investigators would later describe it as one of the worst child torture cases in California history. Veronica Gonzalez wasn't some overwhelmed single mother who'd lost control under stress. She was a calculating abuser who actively participated in torturing her own child, allowing her boyfriend to beat, burn, and sexually assault little Adrian while she watched and sometimes joined in the violence. The toddler's only crime was existing in a household where his mother valued her relationship with a violent man more than her son's life. The abuse escalated over months of unimaginable cruelty. Adrian was beaten with belts, burned with cigarettes, forced to eat his own vomit, and subjected to sexual torture that left him with permanent injuries. Neighbors occasionally heard screaming from the apartment, but no one called authorities to investigate what was happening to the helpless child. Adrian's short life ended when the torture finally killed him, his tiny body unable to survive any more abuse. When paramedics arrived, they found a child so severely injured that veteran first responders broke down at the scene. The toddler had suffered broken bones, burns, and internal injuries that showed he'd been tortured for months before his death. The investigation revealed that Veronica had not only allowed the abuse, but had actively participated in it, helping Aguirre devise new ways to torment her son. Text messages between the couple showed them discussing the torture as if it were entertainment, with Veronica encouraging increasingly violent acts against Adrian. Child Protective Services had received reports about potential abuse in the home, but their investigation had failed to uncover the full extent of the torture. Adrian had been failed by every system designed to protect him, leaving him trapped with killers who saw him as nothing more than a target for their sadistic impulses. At trial, prosecutors argued that Veronica Gonzalez had betrayed the most fundamental duty of motherhood, choosing to torture and kill her own child rather than protect him from a violent boyfriend. The evidence of her active participation in the abuse was overwhelming, including her own admissions about what she'd done to Adrian. In 2017, Veronica Gonzalez was convicted of first-degree murder with torture and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her case joined the growing list of California mothers who'd murdered their own children, proving that maternal instinct doesn't exist in everyone. Case 12. Sabrina Limon. August 17, 2014. A Tehachapi fire station where 38-year-old Robert Limon was preparing for another shift protecting his community, unaware that his wife Sabrina and her lover Jonathan Hearn were about to execute a murder plot that would end his life and destroy two families forever. Sabrina Limon wasn't some unhappy wife trapped in a loveless marriage. She was a calculating adulteress who had been carrying on a passionate affair with fellow firefighter Jonathan Hearn for over a year, exchanging thousands of text messages and planning a future together that required her husband's death. The affair had consumed both Sabrina and Hearn, who worked alongside Robert at the same fire station, while secretly plotting to kill him. They discussed various murder methods through encrypted messages, eventually settling on a plan that would make Robert's death look like a random shooting during a robbery. On that August morning, Hearn ambushed Robert in the fire station parking lot, shooting him twice with a high-powered rifle before fleeing the scene. Sabrina played the grieving widow perfectly, crying at press conferences and begging for information about her husband's killer, while secretly celebrating that her plan had worked. But the investigation quickly focused on the victim's personal life when detectives discovered the affair. Phone records revealed thousands of messages between Sabrina and Hearn, including discussions about life insurance policies and their plans to be together after Robert was dead. The most damning evidence came from text messages sent just hours before the murder, with Sabrina telling Hearn, "I love you," and confirming details about Robert's schedule at the fire station. Other messages showed them discussing how to dispose of the murder weapon and create alibis for the time of the shooting. Hearn eventually confessed to the murder and agreed to testify against Sabrina in exchange for a plea deal. He revealed that she had been the driving force behind the murder plot, constantly pressuring him to kill Robert so they could be together without the complications of divorce. At trial, prosecutors painted Sabrina as a manipulative killer who had used her sexuality to convince her lover to commit murder for her. They argued that she had exploited Hearn's obsession with her to turn him into a weapon against her own husband. Sabrina's defense team tried to portray her as a victim of Hearn's manipulation, arguing that he had acted alone out of jealousy. But the text message evidence was overwhelming, showing clear premeditation and conspiracy between the two lovers. In 2017, Sabrina Limon was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life, plus additional terms for conspiracy. Her case proved that some people will destroy entire families to satisfy their selfish desires. Case 13. Nanette Packard. December 15, 1994. A Newport Beach mansion where 55-year-old millionaire Bill McLaughlin was shot 6 times in his own home by former NFL player Eric Naposki, who had been hired to kill him by McLaughlin's ex-girlfriend Nanette Packard in a scheme motivated by greed, revenge, and a $1 million life insurance policy. Nanette Packard wasn't some heartbroken woman devastated by the end of her relationship with McLaughlin. The 35-year-old had been living off the wealthy businessman's generosity for years, enjoying his money, his cars, and his luxurious lifestyle while secretly resenting her dependence on him. When McLaughlin finally ended their relationship and cut off her financial support, Packard decided he had to die. McLaughlin had made his fortune in the technology industry and was known for his generosity toward the women he dated, often supporting them financially long after their relationships ended. But Packard wanted more than monthly payments. She wanted the $1 million life insurance policy that named her as beneficiary, and she was willing to commit murder to collect it. Packard recruited Eric Naposki, a former NFL linebacker who was working as a nightclub bouncer, to carry out the killing. She promised him a substantial payment from the insurance money and used their sexual relationship to manipulate him into becoming her personal assassin. On that December evening, Naposki entered McLaughlin's home and shot him 6 times, while Packard established an alibi by attending a dinner party with friends. The murder appeared to be a robbery gone wrong, with valuable items missing from the house and no obvious suspects. For years, the case remained unsolved, while Packard collected the insurance money and lived comfortably off her victim's death. She showed no remorse for McLaughlin's murder, instead enjoying the financial freedom his death had provided her. The case finally broke in 2008, when advances in forensic technology and renewed investigation efforts led detectives back to Packard and Naposki. Phone records from 1994 showed suspicious communications between the conspirators around the time of the murder, and witnesses came forward with new information about their relationship. At trial, prosecutors revealed the depth of Packard's greed and manipulation, showing how she had used Naposki's attraction to her to turn him into a killer. The evidence proved that she had been the mastermind behind the murder, planning every detail while letting her lover take the physical risk. In 2012, Nanette Packard was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Her case proved that some people see murder as just another business transaction, with human life valued only in terms of insurance payouts and financial gain. Case 14. Giselle Esteban. May 27, 2011. A Hayward parking garage where 26-year-old nursing student Michelle Lay was about to become the victim of a classmate's jealous rage. Murdered by Giselle Esteban in a crime that would shock the Bay Area and destroy 2 promising medical careers forever. Giselle Esteban wasn't some obvious psychopath who'd shown warning signs of violence. The 27-year-old nursing student at Samuel Merritt University appeared to be a dedicated student working toward a career in healthcare. But beneath the surface, she harbored a deadly obsession with a former friend that would drive her to commit murder. The conflict between Esteban and Lay centered around a man they'd both been involved with, creating a toxic triangle of jealousy and resentment that had been building for months. Esteban believed that Lay had stolen her boyfriend and was determined to make her pay for the perceived betrayal. On that May evening, Esteban lured Lay to the parking garage of Kaiser Permanente Medical Center in Hayward, under the pretense of talking about their shared clinical rotations. Lay, who was known for her kindness and willingness to help fellow students, had no idea she was walking into a death trap set by someone she considered a friend. The confrontation in the parking garage escalated quickly from argument to violence. Esteban attacked Lay with such fury that the assault was captured on security cameras, showing the brutal nature of the crime that would end one life and destroy another. After killing Lay, Esteban disposed of the body in a remote area near Sunol, hoping that her victim would never be found and that the murder would remain unsolved. She returned to her normal routine, attending classes and clinical rotations as if nothing had happened. But the investigation moved quickly once Ley was reported missing. Security footage from the parking garage showed Esteban's car in the area at the time of Ley's disappearance, and cell phone records placed both women at the same location when the murder occurred. The search for Ley's body became a massive effort involving hundreds of volunteers and law enforcement officers. When her remains were finally discovered, the evidence clearly pointed to Esteban as the killer, including forensic evidence that linked her to the crime scene. At trial, prosecutors revealed the depth of Esteban's jealousy and her willingness to destroy everything she'd worked for in order to eliminate her romantic rival. They argued that she had planned the murder carefully, using her knowledge of Ley's schedule and trust to lure her to an isolated location. In 2012, Giselle Esteban was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Her case proved that jealousy can turn even the most promising individuals into killers, destroying multiple lives in pursuit of revenge. Case 15. Charity Kesey. March 17, 2001. Riverside County, where 17-year-old Charity Kesey was about to participate in one of the most shocking betrayals of friendship in California history, luring her trusting friend to a remote location, where she would be murdered by Kesey's accomplices in what became known as the Beltran case. Charity Kesey wasn't some troubled teenager from a broken home who'd fallen in with the wrong crowd. She was a seemingly normal high school student who made the calculated decision to participate in the murder of someone who considered her a friend, proving that evil can hide behind the most innocent faces. The murder plot involved multiple teenagers who had decided that their victim needed to die, though the exact motives remained murky throughout the investigation. What was clear was that Kesey played a crucial role in the conspiracy, using her friendship with the victim to gain her trust and lure her to the killing ground. On the day of the murder, Kesey convinced her friend to come with her to what the victim believed would be a harmless social gathering. Instead, she was walking into an ambush where Kesey's co-conspirators were waiting to kill her in cold blood. The victim fought for her life, but she was outnumbered and had no chance of escape. The teenagers showed no mercy, carrying out their murder plan with a brutality that shocked even experienced investigators who had seen countless violent crimes. After the killing, Kesey and her accomplices attempted to cover up their crime, disposing of evidence and creating false alibis to avoid detection. But teenage killers rarely have the sophistication to commit the perfect murder, and their cover-up efforts quickly fell apart under police scrutiny. The investigation revealed the extent of the conspiracy and Kesey's central role in betraying her friend's trust. Phone records, witness statements, and physical evidence all pointed to premeditation and careful planning, showing that this wasn't a crime of passion, but a deliberate act of murder. At trial, prosecutors argued that Kesey had violated one of the most fundamental bonds of human society, friendship, by using her victim's trust as a weapon against her. They painted her as a cold-blooded killer who had shown no remorse for her actions. The defense tried to portray Kesey as a follower who had been manipulated by older, more sophisticated criminals, but the evidence showed that she had been an active and willing participant in the murder conspiracy. In 2001, Charity Kesey was convicted of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Her case served as a reminder that age doesn't excuse evil, and that some teenagers are capable of the same calculated cruelty as adult killers. 15 women, 6 decades of violence, dozens of innocent lives destroyed by those California trusted most. But here's the most disturbing truth. These weren't born monsters. They were made by greed, jealousy, obsession, and a justice system that often treats female killers as anomalies rather than the predators they truly are. These cases force us to confront questions with no easy answers. Should women receive different treatment in the justice system? Does motherhood excuse child murder when mental illness is involved? How do we balance understanding the factors that create female killers with holding them accountable for their choices. Which case disturbed you most? Do you think Leslie Van Houten deserved parole after 54 years? Should Betty Broderick ever be released? What does it say about our society that we're more shocked by female killers than male ones? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, but remember, understanding these killers isn't about excusing their actions. It's about recognizing that evil doesn't discriminate by gender, and that anyone can become a predator under the right circumstances. Subscribe if you're ready to confront more uncomfortable truths about crime, justice, and human nature, because in a state where dreams come true, nightmares can too.